them into a real fighting force.
He was. And the British, even with their better weapons and resources, they were struggling. The Rampa rebels, inspired by Alluri Sitaramaraju, they fought with incredible courage and determination.
They were giving the British a hard time.
They were. They attacked police stations, government offices, symbols of British authority. In one daring raid in August 1922, they went after 3 police stations: Chintapalli, Krishnadevupeta, and Rajabommangi.
Tell me more.
Alluri Sitaramaraju and about 500 tribal warriors stormed these police stations. They overwhelmed the guards and took a lot of weapons and ammunition.
They were getting ready for a long fight.
They were. And here's something interesting. Alluri Sitaramaraju left a note for the British, telling them exactly what they had taken. He was mocking them, lowering their morale, showing them they weren't unbeatable.
That's bold. He was a brilliant strategist.
He was. But the British, they wanted to crush the rebellion, so they sent a ruthless officer named T.G. Rutherford.
Rutherford, a name that means colonial brutality.
Sadly, yes. He used torture, collective punishment, indiscriminate violence to try to break the spirit of the tribal communities.
Back to the brutality.
Sadly, after a long chase, Alluri Sitaramaraju was captured and executed on May 7, 1924.
What a loss. For a movement with so much potential.
It was devastating. Without their leader, the movement lost steam. But Alluri Sitaramarraju's legacy lives on. He's still a hero in the region, a symbol of tribal resistance, a champion of the oppressed.
His story shows that even against all odds, one person can make a difference and inspire others to fight for justice.
Absolutely. Now, let's go to the Nalamalai forests of Andhra Pradesh, where the Chenchus lived. They were known for their connection to the forests. They launched a unique form of resistance, the Forest Satyagraha.
The Forest Satyagraha. Tell me more.
The Chenchus, like many other tribal groups, were affected by British forest policies that limited their access to resources.
Those forest acts were always causing trouble.
They were. The Chenchus decided to fight back, but they did it in a way that aligned with the Indian nationalist movement, which was growing at the time.
Drawing inspiration from Gandhi's nonviolent resistance.
Exactly. In the 1920s, during the non-cooperation movement, the Chenchus launched their Forest Satyagraha.
What did that involve?
Instead of paying to graze their cattle in the forest, they just sent their herds in without permission.
Defying the British, but peacefully.
Precisely. It was a symbolic act of defiance, asserting their traditional rights, showing their opposition to British control over their forests. The movement was even supported by Gandhi himself. He saw it as a way to connect tribal rights and the fight for India's freedom.
That's amazing. So the Chenchus were at the forefront of linking these two movements.
They were. Their Forest Satyagraha inspired more resistance and highlighted the growing unity between tribal communities and the Indian nationalist movement.
The power of nonviolent resistance and the importance of solidarity against oppression.
Well said. Now let's travel to the northeastern hills, to the Zelian-Grong territory in Manipur, where we have the remarkable story of Rani Gadinlu and her Naga movement.
Rani Gadinlu, the Naga freedom fighter. Her story is incredible. Tell me more about her struggle against the British.
Rani Gadinlu was born in 1915 into the Rongmai tribe, a community that had always resisted British control.
So she grew up around resistance.
She did, and from a young age, she was drawn to the Haraka movement, a socio-religious movement that tried to revive traditional Naga beliefs and practices, which had been suppressed by the British and Christian missionaries.
They were fighting to reclaim their cultural and spiritual identity.
Exactly. Gadinlu quickly rose in the Haraka movement. At 13, she joined, inspired by her cousin, Haipuja Doning. He was a spiritual and political leader within the Zelian-Grong community.
Doning, another important figure in the Naga resistance.
He was. He preached against conversion by Christian missionaries and advocated for a return to traditional beliefs. He also spoke out against British exploitation and the loss of Naga self-rule.
Laying the groundwork for a bigger movement.
He was, and Gadinlu believed in his vision of a free and independent Naga homeland. They understood that true freedom meant cultural and political liberation.
So their fight wasn't just about protecting their culture, it was about political independence too.
You're right. They saw British colonialism as a threat to their way of life, their identity, their right to self-determination.
What happened to Jedening?
Sadly, the British arrested him in 1931 and hanged him after a fake trial. They saw him as dangerous and wanted to silence him.
The British silencing dissent with force.
Sadly, yes. But his death, instead of ending the movement, only made it stronger. Gadinlu, heartbroken but determined, stepped up to lead.
She took over.
She did. At 16, she became the leader, She traveled all over the Naga Hills, organizing her people, preaching resistance, preparing them to fight.
Incredibly young to be a leader.
She was. Her movement combined spiritual revival, cultural assertion, and guerrilla warfare. She was inspired by Gandhi, emphasizing nonviolence and self-reliance, but she also knew that armed struggle was sometimes necessary to defend their land and freedom.
A mix of Gandhi and the reality of fighting colonialism.
Exactly. She told her people not to pay taxes, boycott British goods and services,
Huh.
and resist attempts to control their lives.
Oh.
She also organized a guerrilla force that attacked British outposts, disrupted communication, and asserted Naga control over their territory.
Fighting on multiple fronts.
She was. Her movement grew rapidly. She became a symbol of Naga resistance, a leader for those who wanted freedom.
She posed a real threat to the British.
She did. The British were worried about her influence, so they cracked down hard. They sent in troops and police, offered rewards for her capture, used brutal tactics to try to stop her movement.
Same old methods.
Unfortunately, yes. And in 1932, at just 17, Gandhian was captured and sentenced to life in prison.
Imprisoned for life at 17. For fighting for her people.
It's tragic. She spent the next 14 years in different jails.
What happened after India's independence?
After India became independent in 1947, Jawaharlal Nehru, recognizing her contributions, ordered her release. He even called her Rani, meaning queen, to acknowledge her courage and leadership.
A fitting tribute.
She continued to work for the Naga people, advocating for their rights, promoting education and development, working for peace in the Naga political issue.
She dedicated her life to her people.
She did. Rani Gandhian's story is inspiring. It shows how one person can inspire a movement, challenge injustice, and fight for freedom and dignity. Her legacy continues to inspire the Nagas, and anyone who admires her courage and commitment.
An amazing story. Now, with so many revolts happening across India, I'm wondering, were there any common themes that connected them?
Good question, and the answer is yes, definitely. One of the biggest, as we've discussed, was land. British policies like the Permanent Settlement and the Forest Acts caused lots of land alienation. It disrupted tribal economies and their way of life.
So the British messed up the balance between these communities and their environment.
Exactly. And this disruption, this feeling of being uprooted, fueled a lot of resentment. Another common theme was exploitation. The British often used intermediaries, merchants, moneylenders, local officials, to get resources and enforce their policies. These intermediaries took advantage of the situation, making themselves rich at the expense of tribal communities, leading to debt, poverty, and anger.
So the British used local collaborators to maintain control.
That's right. And this often created tensions within tribal societies, divisions that the British could use to their advantage.
Divide and rule.
Precisely. Then there's the issue of cultural clash. The British, with their Victorian values, they thought their culture was superior. They often saw tribal customs and beliefs as primitive.
That Eurocentric worldview.
Exactly. This clash played out in different ways, suppressing traditional religious practices, imposing Western education, undermining tribal leadership.
It was deeper than economics and politics. It was about their identity, their way of life.
You got it. This cultural threat, combined with the economic exploitation and loss of land, created the perfect conditions for these revolts.
So these uprisings weren't just random events. They were resistance to the whole colonial system.
That's a key point. These revolts were about taking back control, preserving traditions, asserting their right to decide their own future. And it's important to remember, these movements weren't always led by men. Women were crucial too, as spiritual leaders, organizers, even warriors.
Good point. We often hear about the male leaders,
Mm-hmm.
but women were clearly important.
Absolutely. People like Rani Gandhian and others showed the courage and leadership of tribal women.
It reminds us that the fight for freedom and justice involves everyone.
Well said. As we continue, we'll see more of the complexities of tribal resistance.
So we've seen the common themes, but were there any big differences in how these revolts happened, their strategies, their leadership, their outcomes?
Another great question. And yes, there were some variations. Some revolts, like the Santhal Rebellion, were huge and involved open warfare. Others, like the Chenchu Forest Satyagraha, were more peaceful and nonviolent.
A range of approaches.
Exactly. And these differences were often due to things like the specific problems of each community, their resources, their leaders, the political climate.
It makes sense those things would matter.
Absolutely. And the outcomes were different too. Some revolts, even though they were put down, forced the British to make changes, like the Santhal Rebellion and the creation of the Santhal Parganas.
Success even in defeat.
Right, but others, tragically, led to brutal crackdowns, widespread displacement, and further marginalization.
The fight for freedom is long and hard.
Well said. Now, let's head to central India, to Madhya Pradesh, to the Balala Rebellion of 1913. It shook the foundations of British authority there.
The Balalas, another group with a history of resistance. What caused this particular rebellion?
The Balalas, like many other tribal groups in central India, were feeling the pressure from British policies on their land, forests, and revenue. The British wanted more control and more money. So they brought in things that disrupted the Balalas' way of life. Their economies, their social structures, took away their land.
That same pattern.
It is. The Balalas, who used to have autonomy and self-governance, became marginalized and poor under British rule. They had to pay heavy taxes, do forced labor. They couldn't hunt and gather as they used to.
Breaking down their society.
Pretty much. The Balalas, known for their independence and warrior traditions, weren't going to just accept this. Resentment grew. And in the early 1910s, things boiled over.
What were the triggers?
One of the biggest was a new tax on forest produce. The Balalas depended on the forests for their livelihoods. Timber, honey, plants, everything. This new tax, seen as unfair, made them even angrier at the British.
More exploitation.
Exactly. And to make things worse, British forest officials were accused of abusing their power, harassing Balala women, disrespecting sacred places.
Economic exploitation and cultural insensitivity.
Precisely. The Balalas felt like their whole way of life was being attacked, so they fought back.
The rebellion begins.
It did. In 1913, a leader named Tantia Bill emerged. He rallied his people against the British.
Another tribal hero.
Absolutely. Tantia Bill was a skilled warrior and a great leader. He understood why the Balalas were so angry, and he channeled that anger into a movement.
What was their strategy?
Tantia Bill used both guerrilla tactics and open warfare. He knew they couldn't beat the British in a traditional battle, so he focused on surprise, hit-and-run raids, using their knowledge of the land.
Like we've seen before.
Exactly. The Balalas attacked British outposts, police stations, government offices. They disrupted communications, ambushed patrols, targeted symbols of British authority.
Making a statement.
They were. How did the British react? They were caught off guard at first, but they responded with brute force, sent in troops, and a brutal campaign began.
That familiar story. Did the Balalas last long against the British?
They fought bravely. They used their knowledge of the land and their tactics to inflict losses, but they were outmatched. The rebellion was crushed, and Tantia Bill was captured and executed in 1914.
Sad ending for a brave leader.
It is, but the Balala rebellion, even though it failed, left a mark on the region. It showed how determined the Balalas were to resist, and it highlighted the deep resentment towards British rule among tribal communities in central India.
Even in defeat, a step towards change.
Absolutely. These tribal rebellions, even though they're often overlooked, were crucial in shaping Indian history. They challenged the British Empire, showed its brutality, inspired future generations to fight for freedom.
An important part of India's story, showing the resilience and courage of these communities, fighting for what they believed in.
And their stories are important. They show us that resistance takes many forms: armed rebellion, peaceful protest, cultural revival, political movements.
A history that needs more attention.
Absolutely. Now, let's go to Kerala, to the Mappila Uprising of 1921.
The Mappila Uprising. I've heard it was about religious conflict.
Religion was definitely a big part of it, but it was also about the social, economic, and political situation in colonial Kerala.
So there was more to it.
Exactly. The Mappilas, a Muslim community in Malabar, they faced a lot of problems under British rule. Like many other peasants, they were dealing with bad land systems and exploitation by landlords, many of whom were Hindu.
So the usual problems.
Yes, but the Mappilas also felt like their religion was under threat from British policies and the Hindu landlords.
How so? What led to the uprising?
The British, to stay in control, often favored Hindu landlords and elites. They gave them privileges and positions of power. This created an imbalance. The Mappilas felt marginalized and discriminated against.
Excluded from power.
Yes, and Hindu revivalist movements made this worse. They were gaining strength at the time, often promoting Hindu supremacy and trying to push other religions aside.
So economic exploitation.
Yeah.
And the rise of Hindu nationalism.
Exactly. They felt attacked on all sides, economically, religiously, socially.
That's what caused the uprising.
It was. In 1921, a few incidents, disputes over land and religious practices, started the rebellion.
How did it happen? Who were the targets?
The uprising spread quickly through Malabar. They attacked anything that represented the British, Hindu landlords, and anyone seen as helping the British. Mapila rebels attacked police stations, government offices, landlords' homes. They were fierce.
Fighting against the system and the local power structure.
Yes. The British reacted with violence, sending in troops to stop the rebellion.
A community fighting for survival.
Okay,
Against an empire.
that's a good way to put it. The Mapila uprising lasted for months. It changed Kerala forever.
A tough part of Indian history.
It was, but it also made the British rethink their policies. They saw that favoring Hindu landlords and ignoring the Mapilas had caused problems.
They had to admit their role in the unrest.
They did, and they made some changes, trying to improve the Mapila's situation.
The British always reacting instead of preventing.
It's true. The Mapila uprising is a good example. It reminds us to understand the social, economic, and religious things that shaped colonial India.
And the dangers of ignoring them.
Absolutely. Now, let's move to the Northeast again. To the Naga National Council, NNC, in the 1940s.
The NNC, the Naga independence movement.
Exactly. The NNC starting in 1946. It's a turning point for the Naga people. As India was becoming independent, the Nagas, led by new leaders, started to imagine a future outside of India.
They saw independence as a chance to claim their own sovereignty.
They did. They said the Nagas had never been part of India, and they deserved to decide their own future.
Rejecting India entirely.
Yes. The NNC, led by Ngami Zapu Fizo, started campaigning for independence.
Fizo, a major figure.
The father of the Naga nation. He wanted a sovereign and independent Nagaland, free from outside control, where they could govern themselves.
Separating from India completely.
Exactly. The NNC, with Fizo as their leader, protested, boycotted, and resisted peacefully to make their point.
What did India do?
The new Indian government wanted to keep the country together. They saw the Naga desire for independence as a threat.
Two sides.
Exactly. And it led to a long and tragic conflict.
The Naga insurgency.
Unfortunately, yes, the Indian government sent in troops, and a harsh counterinsurgency campaign began.
Forced to stop self-determination.
Sadly, it happens a lot. The Naga insurgency has caused so much death and suffering.
The cost of conflict.
It is. We've learned a lot today about the history of tribal revolts in India. These weren't just random events. They were about resisting colonial rule.
Challenging the British, showing their brutality, inspiring others to fight for what's right.
They did, and they're still relevant today. As we think about tribal rights, social justice, and the effects of colonialism.
Stories that we need to remember.
Absolutely. To everyone listening, especially those studying for the UPSC exams, understanding these revolts is key to understanding colonial India.
They give us insights into what shaped the nation.
Exactly. Pay attention to why each community revolted, how they organized, their strategies, the effects these revolts had.
It's not just about dates and names. It's about understanding history.
You're right. And beyond the exams, these stories are about resilience, courage, and the fight for freedom. They remind us that the fight for justice goes on.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing.